afternoon. Please sit down.
Application 1 of 2019 on the Commission's own motion, 2019 State Wage Order pursuant to Section 50 capital A of the Industrial Relations Act. Application 34 of 2018 on the Commission's own motion, application for the creation of an equal remuneration principle.
Now, Mr Entry, can you continue to appear for the Minister?
I do, Chief Commissioner.
Thank you. And Mr Farrell for CCI?
I do, Chief Commissioner, thank you.
Thank you. Dr Diamond for Unions WA?
I do.
Thank you. And Mr Hanson, you're appearing today for WACOS?
I am.
Thank you. There's lots of doings and I do's and I am's today, so almost like a wedding. Now, the purpose today is to deal with any matters arising from the annual wage review decision of the Fair Work Commission, which issued on the 30th of May. So we could start with you, Mr Entry. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. The expert panel of the Fair Work Commission determined that the national minimum wage and modern award wages in the federal jurisdiction will increase by 3% from the 1st of July 2019. The expert panel's decision was based on a range of economic, social and legislative criteria outlined in the Fair Work Act. It was influenced by a number of key business indicators at the national level that, while still fairly robust, have softened somewhat in recent months. The decision notes that while the Australian economy has performed moderately well and the relevant data is indicative of a stronger labour market, some business conditions have declined from the high levels recorded in the first half of 2018. National employment growth has continued strongly in 2018-19, with the national unemployment rate falling to 5.1% and the employment to working age population ratio reaching a historic high. Inflationary pressure is still very low, and the expert panel noted that increases it's awarded in recent years have had little effect on overall wages growth, either generally or in the most award-reliant industries that are affected by the national wage decision. Following the national wage decision, the Minister reiterates support for a $19.20 per week increase in the state minimum wage and state award wages. The Minister's proposed adjustment represents a smaller increase to the state minimum and award wages than what's been determined for the federal jurisdiction, and that's both in dollar and percentage terms. The Minister's position can therefore be viewed as fairly moderate in light of the national wage decision. A $19.20 per week increase in the state minimum wage would be $2.40 a week less than the $21.60 per week increase determined for the national wage. Importantly, however, the Minister's proposed increase would still provide a real wage increase for the low-paid workers, helping to maintain a framework of fair wages and conditions of employment. In the national wage decision, the expert panel made the following observation, and I quote, "In recent years, the national minimum wage and modern award minimum wages have increased at a faster rate than earnings generally, which has resulted in some improvement in the relative position of the low paid." The expert panel also noted that the requirement to take into account relative living standards and the needs of the low paid supports a real wage increase in the national minimum wage and modern award wages. The Minister concurs with the expert panel's observations and submits that a real wage increase in the state wage case would also benefit the low paid in Western Australia. The Minister's position represents a meaningful and sustainable approach which would contribute to improved living standards for workers whilst also taking account of prevailing local conditions. The Minister notes that the observation of the expert panel that 45 out of 122 national modern awards operating in the federal jurisdiction contain rates of pay that are equal to the national minimum wage, and in all but 6 of those awards, this is a transitional rate which employees move on from after a period of time. So in 39 out of those 45 awards, that's a temporary rate of pay. For some comparison, the Minister conducted a similar exercise comparing state awards and observed that out of 166 state private sector awards with adult rates of pay, a total of 55 contained rates of pay that were equal to the state minimum wage. However, in only 13 of these awards, was the state minimum wage a transitional rate from which employees progress after a period of time. So in many of the state awards, the state minimum wage wasn't a temporary rate of pay. Additionally, there were 3 private sector state awards that appear to still provide rates of pay below the minimum conditions of employment, and a further 9 state private sector awards that contain some junior rates of pay that are below the statutory minimum provided for under the Minimum Conditions of Employment Act. So the state minimum wage would be implied into those awards. The state minimum wage therefore represents the actual safety net applying to many workers in the state system, both for those who are award free, but also for many of those employed under state awards. And that reinforces the need for a fair and reasonable adjustment to minimum award wages in the state wage case, particularly as many employees are unable to automatically progress to higher rates of pay. In the National Wage Decision, the expert panel again reiterated its view that modest regular minimum wage increases do not result in disemployment effects or inhibit workforce participation. It also noted that while low-paid employment is a pathway for many into higher paid work, there are also many instances where this is not the case, and it cannot be indifferent to the living standards of low-paid workers just because many do not stay in that situation for long periods. The expert panel also observed that, and I quote, low-paid workers whose wages are likely to be affected by the national minimum wage or modern award minimum wages are disproportionately located in the lower deciles of equivalised household disposable income for employee households. The Minister notes these observations and submits that low-paid workers in the state jurisdiction also need a meaningful real wage increase to their rates of pay in order to maintain a decent standard of living. For these reasons, the annual wage review decision doesn't give rise to a change in the Minister's position in these proceedings. If it pleases the Commissioner Court session, that concludes the Minister's submission.
Thank you, Mr. Intrican. Mr. Farrell.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. Before I begin, I'm going to refer to a chart, and I have copies for the Commissioner in Court session, if I may, Madam Associate. A copy has been provided to my colleagues here at the bar. As we know, last week the Fair Work Commission's expert panel delivered its verdict to increase the national minimum wage and all modern award wages by 3%. Whilst the panel made reference to the prevailing economic environment in their decision statement, they also provided reasons for the downward revision of this year's minimum wage increase compared to last. And I quote, "We have decided to award a lower increase this year than that awarded last year, having regard to the changes in the economic environment, in particular the recent fall in gross domestic product growth and the drop in inflation, and the tax transfer changes which have taken effect in the current review period and which have provided a benefit to low-paid households. CCI WA submits these factors are also prevalent in Western Australia." The expert panel made further reference to other economic indicators in justifying their decision, and these included national business profits, national wages growth, and the Australian labour market. CCI will be providing further comments on these leading indicators and highlight the key differences between the economic conditions in the Western Australian and national economies. CCI contends that the Western Australian economy is performing very differently to that of the national economy, and recommends the Commission considers these differences in this year's state wage decision. We note that it's incumbent upon the Fair Work Commission to make its determinations in a purely national context. However, as we know, the national economy is a composite of individual state and territory economies, each with their own inherently different structural and geographic characteristics, industry and market sectors, labour market conditions, and demographic characteristics that lead to significant variations in economic performance between the states and territories at various stages of the economic cycle. Western Australia is lagging the remainder of the country on many important economic and labour market indicators. New South Wales and Victoria continue to experience robust economic performance at present, courtesy of significant infrastructure projects. We note that Western Australia represents 14.1% of the nation's total gross state product, and in the past year, Western Australia's gross state product rose by 1.9%, the second lowest rate of change of all the states and territories behind the Northern Territory, and well below the gross domestic product of 2.8%. Highlighting New South Wales and Victoria by the very size of their economic contribution of over 50% of the combined gross state product, and with almost 60% of the national workforce, will appear front and centre in national considerations. The national context in which the annual wage review decision is made represents the aggregation of state and territory economic and labour market performances, and this aggregation disguises the various distortions and anomalies. This is an inescapable fact, given the requirement of the Fair Work Commission to consider the national context. The Fair Work Commission encompasses the range of incorporated businesses, from small to medium to large, that fall within the national system. And it includes Australia's largest corporations and most profitable businesses that reside on the Australian Stock Exchange, through to small incorporated businesses all around the country. The state wage order, on the other hand, encompasses small, unincorporated private sector businesses within the jurisdiction of the Western Australian system. It is for that reason that CCI would submit that in the Commission's deliberations for this year's state wage order, the decision of the Fair Work Commission should be of limited influence. Referring to the labour market, the expert panel, in outlining their relevant considerations behind increasing the national minimum wage by 3%, asserted that the labour market has performed strongly and that the relevant data are all indicative of a strong labour market. The panel made multiple references to the strong national labour market and indicated that this was a relevant factor in considering their decision. Indeed, the national labour market has performed stronger than expected. Australia's unemployment is currently sitting at 5.2% in seasonally adjusted terms, and the Reserve Bank of Australia has suggested that employment has continued to expand by enough to reduce spare capacity in the labour market over the past year. In Western Australia, however, unemployment remains the second highest in the country at 6.1%, almost a full percent higher than the national figure. Over 87,000 Western Australians are unemployed, and a further 131,000 are underemployed and want more work. Our youth unemployment rate is also one of the highest in the country at 13.6%. CCI submits it is clear that Western Australia's labour market performance is much weaker than that of the national market. I now turn to the chart that I provided before my submissions this afternoon. In the relevant considerations section of their decision statement, the Fair Work Commission made reference to national business profit growth of 10.5% to the December 2018 quarter. It's important to note that this figure has not been adjusted for inflation. Referring to the chart, CCI wishes to bring it to the attention of the Commission that recent increases in business profits have been driven primarily by corporate entities in the mining and resources sectors. The latest data shows that, adjusted for inflation, business gross operating profits have grown by 8% over the year to March 2019. However, if you exclude mining from this analysis, the figure drops to 2.4% in real terms. Drawing your attention to the bottom of the chart, unincorporated profit growth has been poor. Over the last 5 years, unincorporated profits have grown in real terms by 1.5% per year on average. Looking within industries, unincorporated total profits have declined in accommodation and food services by 2.4% per year on average, wholesale trade by 6.1% per year on average, and retail trade by 0.7% per year on average. CCI WA contends that differentiating profit growth between corporate and unincorporated entities is particularly important in the context of this state wage case decision, as the majority of businesses captured by the state system are likely to be unincorporated, small and medium-sized businesses operating in the service industries. Turning now to business investment. It's also important to note that business investment in Western Australia is currently subdued and is forecast to decrease by 15% per year this year. More recently, in last week's latest ABS data release of new private sector capital expenditure for the March 2019 quarter, WA recorded the largest decline out of all the states, falling 5.3% over the quarter. This was driven by falls in capital expenditure in buildings and structures of minus 6.2% and investment in equipment, plant and machinery of minus 3.6%. The savings rate. CCI WA would like to refer to the chart on page 14 of Mr Christmas's presentation in the state wage case hearing in May. The chart displays the net household savings ratio for both Western Australia and Australia. It's important to note two things in this chart. The first is that Western Australia's savings ratio is significantly higher than that of the national rate. The second is that both the national and state savings ratios have been declining. Currently in Western Australia, both household consumption and consumer confidence is subdued. CCI WA's latest survey of consumer confidence found that 2/3, or 68%, of consumers believe it is unlikely that they'll make any major household purchases of more than $2,000 in value over the next 3 months. The combination of a low savings rate, subdued consumer confidence and low household consumption indicates that consumers are operating closer to their borrowing constraint. This signals that any increase in spending is likely to flow into dwelling services, mortgages and rent, rather than discretionary consumption. The mining sector has been a major contributor to Western Australia's economic recovery, with mining exports and investment being a key factor in the state's return to growth. Businesses are investing in a wider variety of new mining projects, but these projects will not make up for the major LNG projects that are concluding construction. Business investment will take many years to return to the highs experienced earlier this decade. Western Australia's dependency on the mining sector, while an important and differentiating asset for the state, leaves the state overexposed to fluctuations in the global economy. It's CCI WA's estimation that Chinese consumers and businesses contribute around 30% of Western Australia's economy. Currently, 49% of Western Australia's exports go to China, and 53% of Western Australia's gross state product is made up by exports. Therefore, while positive signs of economic recovery are emerging in a highly competitive trading environment which we have no control over, WA businesses will continue to face challenging business conditions with compressed margins and cost management pressures. CCI WA again urges the Commission to award an increase in the state minimum wage and award minimum wages of no more than 1.4%.
Mr. Farrell, can I just, the total profits chart which you've just handed up
Yes.
a moment ago, I noticed that and I'm assuming this is relative to the number of firms, I don't know whether it's a relative figure or not, but from 2010 the unincorporated total appears to be relatively constant.
Yes,
through to this year.
Yes, Senior Commissioner.
So what are we to draw from that? I mean, presumably the unincorporated business, the numbers of those businesses relative to total businesses is a lesser figure.
Yes.
And so one would expect that their contribution would be a lesser contribution than incorporated firms with mining or without mining. for example. So I'm just seeking to understand what CCI is endeavouring to persuade us from this material, for my purposes at least, say from 2010 onwards, given the figure is relatively consistent.
Thank
And
you.
in answering that, could you also assist me with what particular note we should have this document, given that you gave it to us after explaining that the national economy, which I assume this is a document for, is not something we should have much reliance upon?
Yes, certainly, Commissioner. Two things about this. First of all, we was referring to the referenced by the expert panel to business profits within Australia. The second aspect about this chart is the differences between those that are incorporated and unincorporated businesses. As we all know, the unincorporated businesses are more likely to fall within their Western Australian jurisdiction. Another important thing to note that these are Australian totals, so they're overall, although we would expect a similar type of, well, certainly what we're not saying that would be the opposite effect if Western Australian figures were to be drawn. And whilst I note, Senior Commissioner, that you're correct in terms of, in fact, even beforehand, 2001, 2002, and even the performance has been rather consistent. But it seems it emphasises the point that we've been making since the beginning, that unincorporated firms are operating close to the margin. And the effect of a significant increase in the state minimum wage would put additional pressure on businesses that are close to the operational margin, like the unincorporated businesses, to having to either take on that extra cost or do other things in which they can reduce their living expenses. And we have said previously in what those sorts of things are. So whilst I concede, and certainly it's clear that the performance of unincorporated businesses have been relatively constant for a long period of time, we certainly note that it also reinforces what we've been saying in terms of the fact that they are operating at the point of margin.
Just can you unpack that a bit? How does this tell us, and sorry, I don't mean to stop you from answering Senior Commissioner's question or Commissioner Matthews' question, but how does this tell us anything about margin?
Because it's the rate of business profits, Commissioner Manuel. So
It's total profits in dollar term,
Yes.
in dollars.
Yes.
That doesn't tell us anything about the individual businesses and whether they are operating at the margin. All it says really is that in terms of total profits, the corporate sector in total has had an increase from about 3.5 up to about 8, whereas the unincorporated sector has remained constant. It doesn't tell us anything more than that, does it?
Well,
I'm not sure what we can extrapolate from it.
certainly. Well, our submission is that given the low profit margin, the low profits that have been made, and remember, again, this is Australian totals. Unfortunately, the ABS does not drill down into statewide. So I appreciate that there are unincorporated businesses within the federal system in other states. However, given the low profits that these businesses are making, and it has been consistent, if you look it down as less than $20,000 million in terms of all the throughout Australia, that they are not hugely profitable businesses, and any significant.
We don't know that, do we? They might be in terms of their capital investment, their operating costs. They might actually be quite profitable relative to the resources that go into them. We don't know anything more than that.
I accept that is a valid comment, Chief Commissioner, and absolutely, I suppose, given the data that we have, that's the extrapolation that we have made for that. And
I'm
as
just trying to understand the
Commission-
point, because
yes.
you've spoken a few times about people being close to the margin and
Yes.
basically not really making a profit, and it sounds to me like you're suggesting something to do with, sort of how much risk the business is facing or something along those lines. It's just not obvious to me how that relates to this document.
Certainly. Well, Commissioner Manning, with respect, we're certainly not saying that they're not making profits. Clearly, it's clear that even from this data that they are.
Should we discard comments about margin?
Well, my point that in the submissions that I'm making, ma'am, is that in essence, because of the low profits that they are making, any significant increase in their costs, such as the minimum wage, which these businesses are more likely to come under, particularly here in Western Australia, will say that in itself, it may be incorporated and may be absolved by the businesses themselves. We're not suggesting that that won't be happening. But what we're saying is what you can get from this data, given the roughness of what it is that they are close to the margin, given the low amount compared to the incorporated profits that have been made by businesses in Australia, that can flow on from there.
Thank you, Mr. Aaron.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner.
Dr. Diamond.
Thank you. May it please the Commission in court session, Unions WA's position on the state minimum wage remains unchanged as a result of the Fair Work panel decision. We continue to request that the WA Commission issue a general order to increase award wages and the statutory minimum wage by $43.61 per week or by 6%, whichever is greater. In addressing the national wage decision, the 3% increase announced in the national minimum wage by the Fair Work Commission is certainly a step in the right direction for those workers who rely on the national minimum wage in terms of bringing it towards what we would see as something in the area of the living wage, so the 60% of median weekly earnings, though obviously the claim was not moving things towards that point this year. The extra $21.60 a week is welcome, but obviously we still feel it falls well short of what we think would be an adequate increase. And with that in mind, there are some aspects of the national decision that Unions WA would like to bring to the Commission's attention that we feel are relevant to state wage considerations. So at paragraph 75 of their decision, Fair Work says that despite the recent fall in GDP growth, the Australian economy has performed moderately well, and the relevant data are all indicative of a strong labour market. They go on to say in the following paragraph 76 that the prevailing economic circumstances provide an opportunity to improve the relative living standards of the low paid and enable them to better meet their needs by awarding a real increase in the national minimum wage and award rates. No party identified any data which demonstrated adverse employment or other effects arising from the previous two review decisions, each of which resulted in real increases for the national minimum wage and award-reliant employees. And of course, we would note that those two increases were 3.3% and 3.5% respectively, higher than the most recent increase. Fair Work goes on to say in their paragraph 82 that we are satisfied that the level of increase we have decided upon will not lead to any adverse inflationary outcome, nor will it have any measurable negative impact on employment. Unions WA would argue that Fair Work should certainly be satisfied with that conclusion because we can see, looking back, that in the wake of the 3.5% increase, so the higher increase, inflation actually fell from about 2.1% to 1.3% during this period. We'd take a moment to note that in the Reserve Bank of Australia's statement today, accompanying its decision to lower the cash rate by 25 basis points, it pointed out that recent inflation outcomes have been lower than expected and suggests subdued inflationary pressures across much of the economy. The Fair Work Commission notes in its paragraph 75 the Reserve Bank's statement on monetary policy for May 2019, which observes that although GDP growth has moderated, employment has continued to expand by enough to reduce spare capacity in the labour market over the past year, with employment growth in the first quarter of 2019 higher than the growth in the working age population. However, in Unions WA's view, the Fair Work Commission, notwithstanding its references to the Reserve Bank, has paid insufficient attention to points made by the Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe elsewhere in a recent speech, namely where he points out that the main reason for the shift in momentum in the Australian economy is a slowdown in household consumption growth. Over the second half of 2018, household consumption increased by just 0.75%, which is an unusually soft outcome. And with that in mind, and bearing in mind the 3% increase just awarded, Shane Oliver, the chief economist at AMP Capital, has pointed out that the lower minimum wage increase this year, so lower than 3.3, lower than 3.5, combined with the fact that you estimate around 20% of the workforce on state awards, this is nationally of course, implies basically a 0.1% per annum fall in the overall wage price index. So notwithstanding the Fair Work's previous points, they have, by awarding 3%, a lower minimum wage increase than they had previously, they have effectively sort of ensured that we're going to be looking at lower wage growth rather than the, as the May monetary statement pointed out, the sort of uncertainty about expected household income growth continues to be important for the outlook for consumption. Should households conclude that low income growth will be more persistent than previously expected, households may adjust their spending by more than the current projected consumption, and consumption growth could remain weak for a longer period. So we would argue that by awarding a lower increase this time around, notwithstanding their acknowledgement of the Reserve Bank's fears about consumption growth, the Fair Work threatens to lock in the lower consumption growth rather than the higher consumption growth that the Australian economy needs. And you can already see this in the retail trade figures, which were released today. National retail sales dropped by 0.1% in April, seasonally adjusted. WA in that regard did slightly better. Seasonally adjusted, there was a improvement of plus 0.1%. However, the basic point is that as wages continue to flatline, and we're looking at 6 years of record low wage growth, spending will be cut back. And that spending is very much needed in order to, we would argue, to maintain economic performance. The Fair Work Commission, however, has reacted to lower household consumption by essentially potentially lowering household consumption even further. And Unions WA would argue that the WA Commission should not go down this path. It should award an increase that corresponds to the Unions WA claim, a real increase that lifts both discretionary, frankly, and non-discretionary spending as well. With that in mind, Unions WA would like to turn very briefly to the issue of productivity, specifically as addressed in the CCI's supplementary submission on the question. Unions WA notes that the Productivity Commission's 2019 Productivity Bulletin, which was released today, states that while recent labour productivity growth has been sluggish by long-run standards, it has still been positive. However, this productivity improvement has not translated into comparable real wage growth over the period from 2011-2012, with employees' nominal hourly wages just keeping up with consumer prices. Now, in their supplementary submission on this matter, the CCI argued that multi-factor productivity in WA has grown by less than wages on average per year because, and they use a process of differentiating the contribution of what they call both components of labour productivity growth over this period, business investment in capital and worker and management efficiency. Now, Unions WA would like to submit a analysis of this claim that was done by Dr. Jim Stanford, an economist and director for the Centre for Future Work at the Australia Institute. So I have the documents here. Now, I won't go over the whole paper. It's quite short, and obviously at this point it's up to the Commission how much they want to take account of it. But I will emphasise some key points. First, the Chamber of Commerce's claims that labour productivity can be disaggregated into two components, capital deepening and workers and management together becoming more efficient at completing tasks, really does not have much theoretical or empirical basis. It's not an accurate interpretation of the theory of multi-factor productivity. First of all, it neglects that there are other potential sources of productivity growth. An obvious example would be the impact of training, sort of new skills and investments in what's called human capital. These are essentially improvements in the quality rather than quantity of labour inputs that should lead to higher productivity.
What are you trying to achieve with it? I don't understand. I mean, you don't realistically expect any of this to be in our ultimate decision, given that it wasn't put to Mr. Christmas, no other parties had a chance to comment upon it. Sounds to me like you're getting into some pretty detailed stuff, referencing a document just coming at the last minute, which we couldn't really make much use of. Tell us how we would make use of this document.
You should make use of the
Fairly.
Sorry?
Fairly. How we would make use of this document fairly.
We should fairly make use of the document by simply observing that an attempt to disaggregate productivity into, especially labour productivity, into parts that you should use to judge pay increases and parts that you should use to not judge pay increases, which is effectively what the Chamber of Commerce asked for in its supplementary submission, are simply not a valid way of considering productivity when we're looking at how it should be reflected in pay increases.
Dr. Diamond, I have to say for myself that I do have some concerns that we could go on for months receiving responses to, as we've done so far, we've received responses to everyone's submissions, original submissions. There's been an opportunity to provide us with additional materials in accordance with what we've requested, and that's occurred. You want to now have a further response, and are we then to allow CCI and the Minister and WACOS to respond to this as well? That's a difficulty I'm concerned with in terms of a fair process.
I thought we were here talking about the Fair Work Commission's decision from last week.
We are talking about the Fair Work Commission's decision. The Fair Work Commission's decision certainly has a point to be made about productivity. My reasons for submitting this particular document are that we felt it was relevant, given that there has been some additional submissions made by the Chamber of Commerce. So we're responding to them in their supplementary submissions that came out of sort of a discussion that we had at the previous hearing. So from our...
Where I had raised the question of productivity, but you're now entering into a further debate about that, and that does concern me, that there's no real opportunity for this paper to be analysed and responded to. today's purpose is to deal with the national wage decision, not to have further replies. That's my concern, that this is just going to leave us with something that we just can't answer.
No, well, I guess the perspective that we were taking in terms of offering this particular document was that we were responding to the supplementary submission that the CCI made.
Yes,
About
and
productivity.
this isn't the occasion to do that, Dr. Diamond.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Okay. Well, given that particular perspective, I will conclude the points that we made on the ACTU submission. Was certainly proposing to make up the gap that we would see between the minimum rate and the relativity to with the medium rate in one go. The ACTU certainly proposed a staged process. So in terms of a bridge too far, that was recognised within the ACTU's submission itself. In terms of whether or not it's a useful measure in and of itself, we would refer once again to the point that it's not a figure that has come sort of out of the air, so to speak. It is an internationally recognised standard. In Australia, we do have the award system. We do have a system whereby there are meant to be a sort of a standardised set of rates that come through that system. And we think that it's reasonable, given that process, that there ought to be some attention paid to the gap between the minimum rate and the median rate, because once again, people may argue that exactly where it should be set. People may argue about how much flexibility there should be, especially if, say, we're in the process of a boom or process of things taking off. But it has to be something that a commission pays attention to, because otherwise we are simply left with a very residual sort of low-scale minimum wage indeed, which has severe implications for people's living standards and ability to pay, and ability to spend money in the economy, I should say.
Thank you, Dr. Diamond.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Hanson.
Thank you. May it please the Commission in court session. Following the National Annual Wage Review, the West Australian Council of Social Services position on the needed increase to the state minimum wage remains the same. WACOS reiterates its support for an increase of $43.61 per week to the state minimum wage. WACOS stands by its initial submission, but we do wish to draw your attention to some aspects of the National Review decision that we consider to be pertinent. The Fair Work Commission's expert panel makes the observation at paragraph 64 of their decision that nationally the proportion of low-paid households experiencing financial stress remained broadly stable over the latest year, for which data is available, though 5 of the 8 financial stress indicators increased in 2017. As noted by the Reserve Bank of Australia in its April 2018 Financial Stability Review, however, the incidence of household financial stress is noticeably higher in Western Australia than in other parts of the country, with rising rates of personal administrations, including bankruptcy, debt agreements, and personal insolvency agreements. Rising rates of financial stress and hardship is certainly what has been observed by our member organisations in Western Australia. The Financial Counsellors Association reported in February of this year that during the period of October to December 2018, the National Debt Helpline had seen a 68% increase in calls from 2017. By way of comparison, the next latest increase was 10% in New South Wales.
So the 68% was Western Australia.
Yes, that's correct. And as discussed in our initial submission, Western Australia has seen a dramatic increase in electricity disconnections, with Synergy's disconnection rates have increased by 118% over the past 2 years. The expert panel observes at paragraph 65 that some low-paid award-reliant employee households, namely single earner couples with and without children, and where the non-earning partner is not seeking employment, have household disposable incomes less than the median income relative poverty line. In its discussion at paragraph 328 of the movements of equivalised household disposable incomes between the December quarter 2017 and December quarter 2018, the panel states that for those households on the C14, C10 and C4 wage rates that had disposable incomes below the relative poverty line, increases in wages had not been sufficient to move any household above the poverty line. The panel continues to note, as in previous years, that no data had been identified that supports a conclusion that the increases awarded have had a discernibly detrimental impact on the labour market or the economy more generally. And importantly, the panel also continues to acknowledge the important role of the minimum wage in relation to gender equity, stating at paragraph 399 that increases in minimum wages, particularly adjustments that might exceed increases evident through bargaining, are likely to have a beneficial impact on gender pay equity. In their reasoning for providing an increase lower than the previous year, the panel outlined their consideration of the tax transfer changes in the form of the lower middle income tax offset, effective from 1 July 2018, and the increase in the Medicare levy's low income threshold for the 2018-19 financial year. While the panel recognised that the intent of the offset is to benefit low-paid households, which would be negated if the value of those offsets directly reduced the level to which they would otherwise increase the minimum wage, they stated that it was a moderating factor on their assessment of an appropriate level. WACOS has its reservations about the tax offset having a moderating impact on the determination of the appropriate level, in part as we have concerns that the federal government's entire tax offset package more broadly may impact on the funding and provision of public services and income supports that those on low incomes may rely on. And so what impact and increased pressures those cuts may then have on the living standards of employees. Further, has been suggested by organisations such as the National Foundation for Australian Women that women on low incomes with caring responsibilities actually see an increase in their effective marginal tax rate by 1.5%. Because even if they do receive some benefit from the interim lower middle income tax offset, this benefit will be largely negated by the withdrawal of social security and means-tested family payments, as well as increased costs such as childcare and mean-tested levies. As well as this, we would make note that for those minimum wage earners on inadequate hours that see them earning below the tax-free threshold of $18,200 a year, that they will receive no benefit at all from the tax offset, and so will simply see a lower than otherwise increase to the national minimum wage. If it pleases the Commission in court session, that concludes the submission from WACOS. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr Hanson. Thank you all for your submissions. Our decision's reserved. We will have it to you as soon as we possibly can, and we'll advise you when we will reconvene for the purpose of issuing it. Thank you. We're adjourned.
The hearing stands adjourned.